Hi folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're going to be talking about the new album from Ariana Grande, yours truly. Now, believe it or not, I am not a teenage girl. I know, right? It's so hard to tell, particularly given my music tastes. I like Kesha and Avril Lavigne and Colette Carr and Talia Kills, and I used to watch Glee, and I'm one of the 3 internet critics who gave Demi Lovato and Selena Gomez a fair shot, and I'll probably be the only one who would provide that same courtesy for Miley Cyrus. I guarantee you that a whole swath of reviews of Miley's material will focus less on her music and more on her oh-so-controversial VMA performance, or will completely ignore the fact that she was tied to one of the best songs of the year. But then again, that got me thinking, why do I like this music in comparison with my general distaste for the typical material that teenage boys usually like? But really, the answer to that was pretty simple. Outside of hip-hop and rap, I have a seriously hard time suspending my disbelief and buying into the ridiculous facades of masculinity that these bands like to promote. Even back in 2007, when I was a teenager, I was listening to Nightwish and Blind Guardian, and I was much more impressed by their force of personality and subject matter than the whinging and swaggering self-aggrandizement of the metalcore, hard rock, and screamo scenes. Yeah, I'm not going to deny that there was occasionally scraps of talent in those scenes. I reviewed Say Anything earlier this year, but I never found it remotely compelling. So why do I, unlike some critics, tend to give the artist aimed at the opposite teenage gender more of a pass? Well, if I look a little bit closer, I can say that most of these acts that I like as part of that group tend to be gunning for the same toughness appeal, going for confrontational. But the ones that I like also add flavors of nuance to that confrontation besides plain anger. And maybe it's just me, but it sounds a lot more real and emotionally complex coming from Kesha or Pink or Avril Lavigne, and part of it is because I feel they're actually genuinely trying harder. Let's be honest, most guys don't have to try all that hard to sound intimidating or angry or to impose their presence. And with rare exception, the record industry tends to respond with some skepticism whenever women attempt to match their male counterparts. Do you remember how much flack Nicki Minaj and Lil' Kim went through at the starts of their careers? Yes, it's aggravating and unbelievably sexist, but that means that the ones that succeed work all the harder. And I like seeing effort in music, and I respond well to that. Now, Ariana Grande, on the other hand, doesn't appear to fit the mold of a female pop singer that I would normally like, leaping straight from the teenage sitcom Victorious and styling herself as a pop R&B act, most closely imitating Mariah Carey. Ariana Grande notched her first big hit this year with The Way, which only seemed to play up the fact that she was a young, girly teenager, all bubbly and excitable and very, very innocent. In other words, she seemed to be taking the polar opposite route of her contemporaries in Selena Gomez and Miley Cyrus, and was downplaying her sexuality in order to preserve her fan base following her over from her shows. Okay, not a bad idea, considering how brutally Miley's fan base revolted when she made her transition from Hannah Montana. But at the same time, I didn't really have high hopes for her debut album, yours truly, expecting it to be the same sort of cheaply produced, High School Musical-esque dreck that catered to the lowest common denominator of her fans. So, did I get what I expected? Well, not quite. Ariana Grande's Yours Truly actually isn't nearly as bad as I was stealing myself for. In fact, it's not really bad at all, actually turning out to be quite good. But make no mistake, there are some big problems with this album that will detract from its strengths and ultimately will keep it out of my top 10 for this year. And what's really frustrating about that fact is that none of these problems appear to be the fault of Ariana Grande herself. Let me explain by starting off with the elements that really do work on this album. Ariana Grande has been compared with Mariah Carey, and for the most part, she completely earns that comparison. Now, I've had issues with Mariah Carey for years now, but none of my issues have ever been with her vocal delivery, which has always been gorgeous, and which Ariana Grande matches very well. This girl has a beautiful voice, and she shows impressive range throughout her songs while maintaining her likability, which is a balance many classically trained vocalists have difficulty maintaining. I do wish I could have seen a little bit more in her belting range, But for the most part, she's got a lot of inflection and emotion and sells her material extremely well. She's a naturally gifted singer with a ton of charisma and personality, and I enjoyed her delivery way more than I expected that I would. Now, this is mostly because the songwriting is surprisingly strong. One of the reasons I don't tend to like Mariah Carey as much as many critics do is that the songwriting can often get pretty lazy and terminally underwritten, instead of relying on Mariah Carey's ability to belt and coo and perform vocal gymnastics that might be very very pretty, but lack some of the richer emotional context to really get to me. And yet Ariana Grande and her songwriters do a surprising amount to get me engaged with her material, which is well written, heartfelt, and occasionally a lot more creative and witty than I ever would have expected. Songs like Tattooed Hard, Piano, You'll Never Know, Almost Is Never Enough, and especially Popular Song might have some very simple premises, but the beauty comes out in the little details. Take You'll Never Know, which seems to be like a recreation of Skater Boy by Avril Lavigne for an R&B scene, and surprise, surprise, it actually works, showing enough nuance to make us feel kinda sorry for the guy who never made the move, and yet ultimately support Ariana in her choice. Or take Almost Is Never Enough, which is played with enough world weariness to actually make us care for this relationship falling through because neither side could get it together. And while The Way isn't one of my favorite songs on this album, mostly because Ariana Grande seems infatuated with a bad boy that her teenage fanbase could easily misinterpret in a different direction, her choice of said bad boy is Mac Miller, who is such a dork that to Ariana Grande's innocent young mind, he seems bad even though he's really pretty harmless. That's another strength for Ariana Grande that elevates Yours Truly above the High School Musical waste bucket. The major reasons that I've always disliked material like High School Musical is because it's shallow and it's poorly written, and most importantly, it feels so fake. I don't buy into the faux innocence that High School Musical likes to create, particularly when it's so transparently phony. But Ariana Grande's portrayal of innocence comes from a much more real place, at least to my ears, and it helps that her songs speak about sex at most in innuendo. Now, I can tell a lot of you probably would find this a little too saccharine for your taste, but I don't. Mostly because Ariana Grande sounds legitimately sincere. In songs like Tattooed Heart, she references going steady like it's 1954, and really, it's a reference that fits because the album is so very much pro-love and anti-sex. Of course, that makes songs like Right There featuring Big Sean all the worse, as Big Sean tries to convince us that Ariana is his girl, even though he's got a thick black book full of other girls he's still seeing, which makes Ariana look like she's being exploited by an asshole. And I would understand it if Ariana was trying to play for a harder lifestyle or was implying that she was okay with Big Sean screwing around. But Ariana Grande isn't aiming for that. Instead, she wants to sing a collection of heartfelt, occasionally silly love songs, and there's nothing wrong with that. Now, of course, they aren't all silly love songs, which takes us to my favorite song on this album, Popular Song, featuring Mika. Yes, it samples Popular from Wicked, and yes, it's pretty damn silly, all things considered. The video doesn't help matters. But really, that's what makes the song work so well. Mika and Ariana Grande take the original upbeat, quasi-demented cheerfulness of Kristen Chenoweth and play it perfectly in a great recontextualization of the original sample, flipping the song against vapid popularity in a great subversion. Now, Mika has always gotten a lot of crap from critics for writing some of the most plastic and ridiculously upbeat songs of the early 2000s, but he fits very well here, mostly because he lets Ariana Grande take center stage and he doesn't jump into his helium whine that irritated so many people. And the song, like the original from the musical, is ridiculously catchy and genuinely funny. Definitely the highlight of the album for me. But here's where I have to talk about the big glowing weak spot on this album: the incoherent instrumentation and the disastrous production. Oh, don't get me wrong, there's quite a few songs where the production is sound enough, classical enough to play to Ariana Grande's strengths, and modern enough to not to sound like a throwback. But like Justin Bieber's album Believe from last year, it's clear that nobody has the slightest clue where to take this album instrumentally. The worst tracks on this album alternate from drawing inspiration from Mariah's early 2000s work and trends in modern hip-hop, which means so many of the tracks are punctuated with sloppy synths, badly chosen samples, and an anonymous chorus of guys shouting "Ay!" in the background. And while I was annoyed by the lack of organic instrumentation on Natalia Kills' album, I was genuinely angry by some of the instrumental choices here. With the exception of Popular Song and arguably The Way, Ariana Grande sounds best with minimal accompaniment, and too often we got cluttered, barely on tune instrumentation instead that clashes badly with her delivery. And the production is even worse, leaving too many songs sounding flat and completely lacking the dynamic sound that gave Mariah her strength on her earlier albums. It's rare that Ariana Grande's voice is given enough space on the mix to truly dominate, as too often the track is cluttered with sound effects that do nothing to enhance the overall sound of the song. Worse still is the occasional auto-tune on Ariana's backing vocalist, which does not fit fit in the slightest when set up against Ariana's vocals. Auto-tune should be nowhere on this album. The overproduction here does nobody any favors, and what's all the more infuriating is that it's not Ariana Grande's fault. Producers, you're not producing for Rihanna or Katy Perry or Britney Spears, acts who need all the help in the instrumentation they can get. You've got a singer with a beautiful voice and a lot of personality who can stand on her own, so give her center stage already. But despite even these issues, I think I can still recommend Yours Truly by Ariana Grande. It's innocent and sweet, maybe a little bit too sweet at points for some listeners, but there's a lot of charisma and personality and sincerity on this record, and I liked it a lot more than I would expect. If you're one of her teenage fans, you're gonna love this album, and for a guy who isn't traditionally much of a fan of R&B, it's a big plus in my book. If you're looking for a young artist in the vein of Mariah Carey and with good enough songwriting to actually back her up, you could definitely do a lot worse than Ariana Grande's Yours Truly. I recommend this album. Check it out. So yeah, that's the first big wave of albums coming out earlier this month. And the second wave's coming around September 9th and 10th, so I gotta start preparing for that. Alternately, you can like and subscribe, and I've got more videos on the way. See you next time.